Hello, friends. Welcome to this podcast. This is the first ever podcast that I'm recording with video. We'll see how that goes. It's definitely a much more difficult and very different to do it than just audio. This is the third episode of the Divine Rational podcast, and it's the second part of Build Your Own Philosophy. In the first part of Build Your Own Philosophy, we talked about the what and why, which is what is philosophizing and why we should do it. And in this part and in future parts of Build Your Own Philosophy, we're going to be talking about a much more difficult question, which is the how, essentially. And so since you're here, I'm assuming that you kind of bought into the what and why of things, and now you kind of want to understand the how. And in this part of this podcast, we're going to be talking a lot about ontology. And for me, it's a very important piece of the puzzle, even though pure existentialists don't really believe in an ontological view of existence. But I think it's something that's very important to get straight because it has consequences on other ways that we see the world, essentially. For example, it might lead to more of a free will versus deterministic view of reality, as well as it has an influence on the objectivity versus subjectivity divide, and many other things. So with the ontological question, it kind of has a ripple effect into other views, essentially, and it will help us build a stronger, more grounded philosophy, no matter what you choose. So first, let's talk about what is ontology. Basically, it's the philosophy that deals with existence. It asks what exists, how does it exist, how can it be grouped and organized together. In other words, ontology tries to answer what things are and how they relate to one another. In our exercise, ontology will help us understand the external world and how we kind of fit into it. And we'll see later how ontological frameworks transfer to many other views that we may have, essentially. I think we need to be careful to construct a nuanced understanding and balance ontology so that we aren't led down dangerous paths such as communism or nihilism, which is, I think, as a result of a poorly framed ontological framework that people have. But more on that later. So in this podcast, we were going to be talking about various ontological frameworks proposed by some notable philosophers. And we'll start with materialism and realism. Then we'll talk about idealism, rational and process ontology, existentialism as an ontology, which is kind of a misnomer, but we'll talk about that later, and dualism. And then I'll also kind of finish off talking about how I put some of these ontologies together for my personal framework and what you might want to try to do. Essentially, we'll come up with this kind of ontological buffet that we can choose and pick from. And keep in mind, this is philosophizing. We're not building some kind of universal framework or a philosophical thesis. It's more just about helping us understand how we see the world at this time. So that might change. The idea is that, as we gain more experience, knowledge, and understanding, we might come back to our ontological framework and adjust it. But for now, it's going to be as best as we see the world in this ontological framework. We're going to try to build that up, and from that we'll construct other pieces to help us with our philosophizing going forward, essentially. So let's dive into our first ontological philosophy, which is materialism/realism. Realism is just a superset of materialism. It's a broader framework that holds materialism, even though materialism is the most popular sub-framework of realism. But so I kind of combine them because, again, we're just interested in the broad strokes of these ontological philosophies, and to kind of like help us guide us along. I would definitely recommend anyone who's interested in any particular framework that I go over to dive deeper into it, do some research, read some books, or even some of these original philosophers, which I'll mention later. But but ultimately, what is materialism? Materialism basically says that everything can be boiled down to physical phenomena. And when I say materialism I kind of mean materialism and realism. I almost use them interchangeably, even though there is some differences between them. They also materialism and realism also believes that things exist independent of our existence or cognition, and a lot of times the focus is on empirical evidence, scientific inquiry. Ultimately, this ontology believes that everything can be boiled down to physical entities and processes. Some notable philosophers include Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, John Locke, Karl Marx, and a more contemporary one is Daniel Dennett, who I personally really enjoy reading. He's one of the four horsemen, one of the New Age atheists. Even though I may disagree with him on a lot of things, Daniel Dennett is a fantastic philosopher and an incredible mind. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail on where I stand on materialism and realism. I'll do that later because I kind of want you to have an unbiased perspective before I dive into my own ontological framework. But ultimately, remember, materialism and realism basically says everything exists as physical entities and processes. There's nothing else beyond that type of thing. To contrast materialism and realism is idealism as ontology, which basically fundamentally believes that everything is mental or spiritual. It's kind of everything can be abstracted into some sort of mental framework or spiritual framework, and matter is only perceived through that cognition type of thing. Some notable philosophers of idealism is Plato, lightly, I should say, not exactly. Some consider Plato also a dualist in some of his philosophies. George Berkeley, Immanuel Kant, to some extent Hegel, some might consider. Let's go on to the next ontology, which is relational and process ontology. Again, I group two of these together. One is, again, a superset of the other. Process ontology is a subset of relational ontology. That is kind of like a broader topic. This basically says that things exist only in relation to each other, or even within it to its constituent parts. Ultimately, relations are ontologically primary in this view. So essentially, if something exists on its own, it doesn't really have any meaning. So we kind of define things only in relations to each other. It's a very interesting philosophy with some more contemporary philosophers, including Alfred Whitehead, Charles Hartshorne. Some more classical philosophers or ancient philosophers are Heraclitus of this type of view, and others include Leibniz and Hegel as well. Next, I want to talk a little bit about existentialism as an ontology, or rather as an antithesis to ontology. Pure existentialists do not actually believe in an ontology because, again, existence comes prior to your own personal existence, I should say, comes prior to the existence of other things. So everything is kind of interpreted through your own personal experience, and not necessarily the existentialists, pure existentialists don't necessarily believe in some sort of universal or non-subjective understanding of the universe. So I want to talk about this here because it's also some kind of it is an ontology that's opposed to generic ontologies or universal ontologies. So most existentialists kind of shy away from these type of formal ontologies that I mentioned before. Even though I think even if you are a pure existentialist, it's still a good idea to understand some of these ontologies that I've mentioned and that I will mention because they at least they provide some sort of guidance as to how you might understand the world, even if you don't subscribe to any particular ontology, or at least it gives you an understanding of how others might understand the world. But again, existentialism stands in a large part opposed to formal and universal ontologies, formal understandings of our universe and how things exist, because they're kind of separate from your individual or our individual existence. And the final ontology that I want to talk about, and I leave this one for last for a reason, this is one that Descartes is very famous for, and that's dualism. And this is the idea that things exist, that things exist as material things, kind of similar to this materialist view, but also in this mental spiritual realm as well. And the people who are obviously the philosophers who are popular for this type of ontology, that things exist in this kind of duality of nature, one spiritual and mental, and then the other physical, are Descartes, Plato, Leibniz, Henry Moore, John Eccles, and St. Thomas Aquinas. And this kind of concludes the broad ontological frameworks that I want to talk about. There are others, and there are more subsets of the ones that I mentioned. You can dive very deep into any one of these kind of understandings, and I just covered the broad strokes of each of these. So please feel free to do your own research about them. I find them very interesting, and they opened up my eyes as to how to see the world before me and kind of how I fit into it. So now that we kind of have a buffet of ontologies and different ways of seeing how things could exist or how things are in our world, we can kind of pick and choose what speaks to us. And again, the reason why it's important, because each one of us will have different experiences and knowledge, and different ontologies will speak to you as a person. For example, scientists who are very, very focused on cognition and who spend so much time learning about science and physical things, they will naturally tend towards materialism. Those who are very spiritual might tend towards idealism, and so on. And so I suggest that basically you try to put these two together, and put these ontological frameworks together, pick the ones that speak to you most, and see how you can either make them work together or subscribe to a specific one. But ultimately, that's why I wanted to go over them in broad strokes first. And now I'll kind of talk about my own ontological framework and how I built it. So as you may have guessed, I'm not a pure materialist, just because this is the Divine Rational podcast where I try to balance rational thought against kind of spiritual introspection. But at the same time, I believe when I was an atheist and I kind of had more secular ideals, I would call myself a near pure materialist. That has changed since then. The way that I see the world, I kind of compose multiple ontological frameworks with one overarching one. So what I subscribe to I subscribe to dualism, the idea that there is this spiritual and mental realm of existence, or of things existing, I should say. And then there's also this physical realm. And in the physical realm, on this part, I kind of subscribe to materialism as the broad framework of the physical side of dualism, as well as with relational ontology, because I really think that understanding things in relations to each other makes a lot of sense to me. This is kind of what really spoke to me. But in terms of the physical world, I think largely it can be explained through materialism, through science, through facts, through that understanding. That's why I like dualism, because it allows me to hold two or multiple almost opposing frameworks, and it just kind of like separates them into their own realm, even though there is some interaction between these realms, in my opinion. But ultimately, I could still hold materialist thoughts about the physical world and still have a separate ontology about this spiritual mental realm. And on the spiritual mental side, I subscribe to existentialism and relational ontology. So I think I mentioned that I'm not a pure existentialist, even though I subscribe to a lot of existentialist tenets. And that's partly how I do it. On the one hand, I believe there is some sort of, physical objective reality, but on the mental spiritual side, I think existentialism, along with relational ontology, rule this world realm for me. Now, they interact. These realms interact. It's not like there's a pure separation between the two. It's not like church and state type of thing, but you can inspect the material world and understand the physical world rightly very well through materialism and relational ontology, even though you cannot explain it all just because of the sheer complexity, and on top of that, the influence of non-material of the non-material realm onto the material realm. So even though you can explain a large portion of it, and part of the beauty of materialism is this ability to explore this physical world in great detail, with great scientific precision, while knowing that not everything can be explained. There will always be something else to explain. But ultimately, that's my framework. So dualism, to separate the material and physical from the spiritual, and in the physical world, materialism and relational ontology, and in the spiritual realm, mental spiritual realm, existentialism and relational ontology. So in a way, for me, dualism acts like as a super ontological framework that holds other ontological frameworks within it, and allows them to, I'm allowed to kind of hold two competing thoughts while still not necessarily, while still being consistent, at least for myself. And that's my understanding. So that's kind of where I stand. I hope you enjoy that. I encourage you to kind of figure out what is your ontological framework. Again, you can pick and choose from different ontological understandings by some some giants in philosophy. Read about it and dive deep into it. But ultimately, for philosophizing, what is your ontological framework for right now? That is, as best as you understand the world from your experience, from your education, and so forth. How do you see the world? Because later, I think that ontological framework, and it might be that you don't hold any ontology. Maybe you're a pure existentialist and you don't believe that the world can be understood through this type of, through any type of formal ontology. But the lack of a formal ontology is still an ontological perspective that you'll have. I would suggest that, anyways, that's something that we'll dive into deeper, and we'll see how holding any particular ontological framework, whether it's you don't have one like existentialists, or it's something like materialism, it could lead down to other views of the world, and it'll lead into certain views about how you see yourself fitting into this world. So we'll see. We'll talk about that in our next in the next part of this series. But I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that I was able to enlighten you, or at least give you some perspective as to what's out there and how you might be able to build this type of idea of how you see the world. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy it. Cheers.